Mr. President, irrespective of how the presidential election had come out this last November, we would be having a conversation about how to fix Obamacare. And there are many reasons for that, but most importantly is it has just skyrocketed costs for people in this country. Premiums have gone through the roof. Deductibles have increased. Co-pays have increased. Out-of-pocket costs have become so expensive for people that even if they have coverage, they can't use their plans in many cases. And so when our colleagues across the aisle talk about the recently rolled out proposal coming from the House, which they will be discussing and we eventually will be discussing, to try and drive down the costs for people in this country, that's what this debate really is all about. Now, you can say what you want, but the fact of the matter is that this last year, in 2017, premium increases are 25% in the exchanges. 25%. 6 states, the premium increases were 50% in the exchanges. I mean, I don't know how anybody, any family in this country can keep up with those kinds of skyrocketing premiums. And if you're buying your insurance in the individual market, I mean, it's just the roof is blown off. I talk to people in my state of South Dakota all the time, Mr. President, who share with me the excessive amount that it costs now for them to cover themselves and their families. I talked to a lady in Sioux Falls just recently at an event who told me that they're now paying $22,000 a year. $22,000 a year for health insurance. That's not working. That's why what we had was a failure. It was an abysmal failure. And in terms of choices, you know, the whole idea was people are going to have options out there. Well, there are a third of the counties in America today, 1/3 of the counties in America today, where people have one option, one insurer. Pretty hard to get a competitive rate when you've only got one option. That's a virtual monopoly in a third of the counties in America today. So you have markets collapsing, insurers pulling out, and we saw that last fall. The Blue Cross Blue Shield pulled out of the individual market in South Dakota, left 8,000 people wondering how they're going to continue to cover themselves with health insurance. The markets are collapsing, choices are dwindling, and costs are skyrocketing. So the senator from Michigan who was just in here talking about, you know, how terrible things are going to be under the proposal that's being considered and discussed in the House of Representatives. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. President, things are terrible today. That's why we're having this conversation. 8 in 10 Americans think that Obamacare either ought to be repealed entirely or dramatically changed, significantly changed. And it is, by any estimation, by any objective measurement or metric, it has been a failure, and that's why we're having this conversation. And that conversation would have occurred irrespective of what happened in the presidential election last fall. So let's be clear about why we're here and why we're having this conversation and why we're coming up with a better solution for the American people that will drive down their costs, which will give them more choices, create more competition in that marketplace, and give them a higher and better quality of care because it restores the doctor-patient relationship, which is so important, and not having the government intervene and be in the middle of all that. Well, Mr. President, we have a recovery that technically began almost 8 years ago, but for too many Americans, it still feels like we're in a recession. Americans have basically not had a pay raise in 8 years. Since the recovery began in 2009, wage growth has averaged a paltry 0.25% per year, 1/4% increase in pay per year since 2009. Well, imagine that if you're a family and you're looking at everything that's going up in your lives, whether it's health care, which I just talked about, or the cost of education, or the cost of energy, or the cost of food, all these things that continue to go up, and you're getting a 0.25%, 1/4% pay raise on an annual basis. Pretty hard not to feel like you're starting to sink and your head's going to be below water before long. Well, good jobs and opportunities for workers have been too few and too far between. And so millions of Americans are working part-time because they can't find full-time employment. Even as some economic markers have improved, our economy has stayed firmly stuck in the doldrums. Economic growth for 2016 averaged a dismal 1.6%. And there are a few signs that things are improving. And by the way, the historical average going back to World War II is about 3.2% average growth, annual growth in the economy. So last year we were at 1/2 of what the average has been going back all the way to World War II. Well, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office is projecting average growth for the next 10 years, at just 2%. In other words, long-term economic stagnation. The good news, though, Mr. President, is that we don't have to resign ourselves to the status quo. We can get our economy going again, and Republicans are committed to doing just that. To get our economy going again, we need to identify the reasons for the long-term stagnation we're experiencing. A recent report from the Economic Innovation Group identified one important problem: a lack of what the organization calls economic dynamism. Economic dynamism, as the Economic Innovation Group defines it, refers to the rate at which new businesses are born and die. In a dynamic economy, the rate of new business creation is high and significantly outstrips the rate of business death. But that hasn't been the case in the United States lately. New business creation has significantly dropped over the past several years. Between 2009 and 2011, business death outstripped business births. And while the numbers have since improved slightly, the recovery has been poor and far, as I mentioned before, from historical norms. The Economic Innovation Group notes that in 2012, the economy's best year for business creation since the recession, it fell far short of its worst year prior to 2008. Well, this is deeply concerning because new businesses have historically been responsible for a substantial part of the job creation in this country, not to mention a key source of innovation. When new businesses aren't being created at a strong rate, workers face a whole host of problems. A less dynamic economy, the Economic Innovation Group notes, and I quote here, is one likely to feature fewer jobs, lower labor force participation, slack wage growth, and rising inequality. Exactly what we see today, end quote. Well, Mr. President, American workers clearly need relief, and restoring economic dynamism is a key to providing it. We need to pave the way for new businesses and the jobs that they create, and we need to ensure that current businesses, particularly small businesses, are able to thrive. There are a number of ways that we can do this. One big thing that we can do is to relieve the burden of excessive government regulations. Now, obviously, some government regulations are important and necessary, but too many others are unnecessary and doing nothing but loading businesses down with compliance costs and paperwork hours. The more resources businesses spend complying with regulations, the less they have available for growth and innovation. Excessive regulations also prevent many new businesses from ever getting off the ground. Small startups simply don't have the resources to hire individuals, let alone the consultants and lawyers to do the costly work of complying with scores of government regulations. Unfortunately, over the past 8 years, the Obama administration spent a lot of time imposing burdensome and unnecessary regulations on American businesses. According to the American Action Forum, the Obama administration was responsible for implementing more than 675 major regulations that cost the economy more than $800 billion. Well, given those numbers, it's no surprise that the Obama economy left businesses with few resources to dedicate to growing and creating jobs, or that new business creation seriously dropped off during those years in the Obama administration. Well, since the new Congress began in January, Republicans have been focused on repealing burdensome Obama regulations using the Congressional Review Act. We've already used this law to repeal 3 Obama regulations, and this week we'll use it to repeal at least 2 more, including the blacklisting rule, which imposes duplicative and unnecessary requirements for businesses bidding on federal government contracts, and the Bureau of Land Management methane rule, which curbs energy production on federal lands by restricting drilling. This methane rule would cost jobs and deprive state and local governments of tax and royalty payments that they could use to address local priorities. Another area of regulatory reform we need to address is Obamacare. As I mentioned, repealing the burdensome mandates and regulations that this law has imposed on businesses will go a long way toward removing barriers to new businesses and spurring growth at existing businesses. Another important thing that we can do, Mr. President, is remove unnecessary barriers that restrict access to capital. Both new and existing businesses rely on capital to help them innovate, expand, and create jobs. In addition to removing burdensome regulations, tax reform needs to be a priority. Measures like allowing new businesses to deduct their startup costs and reducing rates for small businesses would spur new business creation and help small businesses to thrive. Well, Mr. President, Republicans plan to take up comprehensive tax reform later this year, and I look forward to that debate. The American economy has always been known for being dynamic and innovative, and we need to make sure that it stays that way. We need to free up the innovators and the job creators so that the next big idea isn't buried by government regulations before it has a chance to see the light of day. Sluggish economic growth doesn't have to be the new normal. By removing burdensome government regulations and reforming our tax code, we can spur business creation and innovation, and we can increase wages and opportunities for American workers, and we can put our economy on the path to long-term health, where that growth rate gets back to that more historic level that allows for better paying jobs and higher wages for American families. Well, Mr. President, I look forward to working with my colleagues in both houses of Congress to achieve these goals, and I'm anxious for us to start passing bills that will put policies in place that are favorable to higher economic growth, better jobs, and better wages for American people and their families. I yield the floor.